Really delighted to see so many here. We know we have stiff competition in this opening slot, and we really didn't even expect this many people, so it's wonderful. Guillermo, you were going to begin by talking a little bit about Ramanujan and the significance of his contribution, some of the areas of his contributions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For those of you who are not familiar with one of the most fascinating contemporary Indian writers, translators, scholars, poets, and even linguists, A.K. Ramanujan was from Mysore in the south of India, in the state of present Karnataka. He was born in 1929, and he was soon standing out as an incredible, very creative writer of radio plays. When he was 14 and 13 at college, at high school, he started scribbling his first poems in Kannada, and immediately the professors who were looking after his student career. He was in mathematics, he was in science because his father was a famous mathematician. By the way, I don't know if many of you know that A.K. Ramanujan is called Ramanujan because his father, who was hailed from Tamil Nadu, was very close to Srinivas Ramanujan, the mathematician. In fact, Pachayappa's college in 1911, in those days, when Ramanujan went, the Srinivas Ramanujan was invited to Cambridge, and then he came back, and he became a very popular figure. They befriended, they became friends, and he named his second son Ramanu after the famous mathematician. So the reason I want to start with mathematics is because the cultural milieu in those years, we're talking about the 1940s in Mysore, middle-sized town, which had a burgeoning, if you want, society of writers that were scholars that were looking at India in the independence struggle. They had two kind of agendas, because on the one hand, the nationalist movement that had brought about quite a bit of turmoil, but also the Dravidian kind of nationalist movement that was there at the time, were two kind of tensions that Ramanujan grew up with. And he was set to become a famous mathematician because his father wanted to become a mathematician. So science and mathematics was very much there in his life, but he kind of drifted away and drifted into poetry, playing magic tricks. He loved to perform magic, and he was always into the mystery of things, where stories he liked to research and listen to at his, the metaphor of the house of Ramanujan was very famous, became very famous because he structured the whole idea of what India the metaphor of India as a combination of the folk, the oral traditions and next to the fireplace. That was the ground floor, where the grandmothers used to tell stories and tales. Then you had the mother who spoke in Kannada, the mother tongue, and the folklore of the Kannada tales that were told to him, he absorbed from very young age. And then you had the space where the father received all the famous scholars who were at the time coming through Mysore, and you had the English tradition there as well. So Ramanujan grew up in multiple languages, multiple traditions, and those layers that were there already in his house became very crucial metaphors later in his life. So he was reflecting on that inheritance of both the British colonial period, if you want, where the romantics were taught at school, but at the same time he was absorbing the oral traditions, from its very ecosystem. So he became one of the first scholars to, on one hand, study the folklore He ran around the small villages collecting folk tales. He had this amazing curiosity about things. And that curiosity brought him to... Sorry, I think there's a problem with... Oh, it's a radio.
Oh.
Yeah. So let's switch it off.
Let's switch it off.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So something crucial happened. So here we have Ramanujan, then it's not the radio. It's the wizard in the radio.
Shall we switch to this mic? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, give me that. Take this off.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes. So I want you to understand where the roots where he came from, because he was immediately brought into what we can call the in Europe, we call it the Renaissance kind of approach to arts and science, where you cannot distinguish one from the other. He grew up in an environment where everything came natural. You know, science, astronomy, and astrology were part of the same thing. So he would not distinguish between. He would connect science immediately, Spinoza, with Bhakti poetry or with the Tamil Sangam poems, and these connections were made all the time. So his childhood was quite unique in the sense that he was not only drawn to the folk tales, but he shunned he rejected his Brahminhood from the age of 16. So he didn't want to follow the same path as his parents. At the time, perhaps that whole the tension that he lived through in his rebellious years as a 16-year-old boy convinced him that tradition was something that had to be individualistic. He didn't want to inherit his father's Brahmanism, and he ran. He threw away his sacred thread. And that was perhaps something that probably other Brahmins, he may not have been unique in that sense, but what he did was he had to find his own identity in a tradition which could speak to him, and he found that in the Bhakti Vachanas, in the movement of the medieval revolutionary or individualistic relationship with your own God, your own way of expressing divinity. And those mystic poems that spoke to his heart as a poet and somebody that's rooted and understands the intricacies of those poems gave way to his assertion of tradition, which was not Brahminical. So there was immediately this kind of looking at things from another angle, looking at the subaltern, looking at the downtrodden, be it oral traditions that were neglected at the time. Everything was Sanskrit and Vedic traditions, which was considered the high, the great traditions. And he would immediately look at the small underdog, the traditions that nobody considered very seriously. And he found it, as a poet himself, inspiration in those Bhakti poems, and started writing his own poems in English at the age of 17 or 18. So first he wrote in Kannada his own sketches, poems, and radio plays. This is a homage to him as a writer of radio plays. He performed his own radio plays on All India Radio. 25 radio plays he wrote. So these are things that not many people know about, and that's why I wanted to talk about Ramanujan before he came to Chicago. So to cut the long story short, then with that baggage, he, in 1959, was given a scholarship. He was studying linguistics at Pune because he became a professor of English. He dropped mathematics, became a professor of linguistics, which kept his interest in science alive, because linguistics is like a science and a poetry. And he moved on to the US on a ship. 1959, he boarded from Bombay. And here's this Brahmin boy who had already rejected his tradition, jumping on a new adventure which would take him into unknown territory and quite a bit of trouble also, as he said, with women and food. And I was able to watch the other day the film on the mathematician, Srinivas Ramanujan, and there you can say a similar thing where, you know, the mother doesn't want the son to go abroad because he's a Brahmin. Well, in this case, this is like 40, 50 years later, in 1959, it was his own decision to leave India and find a bright future in America, and nobody knew where that would end up, and it did end up in the early 60s. He was hired happily, it was a happy story, he was hired as a Dravidian professor at the University of Chicago, where our dear friend Philip was able to be a student, and I want him to, I want him now to talk about that period of his life.
Thank you, Guillermo. You know, one of the amazing things about this festival is the way that it brings people together unexpectedly. And so here is this Spaniard whom I met for the first time last night, who knows more than anybody probably at this point in the world about this great writer and poet and scholar who was one of my own very dearest gurus and mentors. A.K. Ramanujan was the chair of my PhD dissertation at Chicago, and I took many classes with him and had many wonderful occasions to enjoy what we call in Hindi his satsang, his auspicious companionship, and to learn from him. But he was as Guillermo said, he was a linguist, he was a brilliant linguist. And also a translator and poet. And one of his great achievements after he came to the University of Chicago, which was what year? 62, yeah. I was an undergraduate starting in 67. But I don't think at that point I took any classes with him. It wasn't until I came back a decade later as a graduate student that I got to know him well. Dennis McGilvray was his TA for a while in the late 60s, professor from CU here. But Raman began doing a series of translations, and I know some of you probably know of them. The first book that I just want to mention, in case people don't know it, is a book called The Interior Landscape, which he brought out, I don't know, 67. Guillermo, it's great. You're going to be able to give us all these details. The Interior Landscape is a book of translations from the very earliest literature of classical Tamil, the Tamil language from South India. And this is a body of literature that had largely been forgotten, was discovered in the early 20th century. It dates back to perhaps even the first few centuries before the beginning of the Common Era, but certainly the first few centuries of the Common Era. And it's a poetry of, well, the poems that he chose to translate in this book deal with love and with the psychology of love, and they're extraordinary. And Raman had an extraordinary voice for bringing them into a kind of modern English and making them speak across the centuries, often from the perspective of women involved in love relationships. And it was a book that was absolutely revelatory to those who read it. And I mean, it just opened up a world that nobody knew existed. Everybody had heard of the Bhagavad Gita, you know, and the Ramayana, which I work on. But they didn't know that there were these poets in, 2,000 years ago in South India writing these extraordinary, insightful, psychologically insightful observations about human emotions. And so that was a great contribution that he made. And many of the people today who are scholars of Tamil in the United States, it all began for them with reading, The Interior Landscape back in whenever, the 70s or 80s. Subsequently, as Guillermo mentioned, he got interested in, he went back to his childhood interest in the vachanas. Vachana literally means utterances of these 10th, 11th, 12th century Karnataka, very radical, religious radical poet saints who were devotees of Shiva, but a Shiva who was beyond forms, and a Shiva who was very deeply personalized and who went totally beyond any kind of caste divisions. And he brought out this beautiful book called Speaking of Shiva, which I think is still widely available in a Penguin paperback. And again, the poems that he chose, the way that he translated them, his wonderful gift as a translator really makes these poems come alive for modern English readers. And again, this was literature that nobody in the West and hardly anybody in India outside of Karnataka and outside of the particular sectarian tradition that later developed around these poets, hardly anybody knew about it. And Raman really brought it to the world and put it into world literature. He then later did this book called Hymns for the Drowning. This is the other major Bhakti translation that he published. Hymns for the Drowning is from the very earliest Tamil devotional poems to Vishnu. And the Vishnu was, the poet's name was Namalvar, and he was from a lineage of poets known as Alvars, which means the drowned ones. And they were poets who had immersed themselves in devotion to their God and had sort of drowned themselves in God, but they still kept really interesting voices and really ironic perspectives and kind of amazing insights into what it is to be human. And this, again, Raman brought out very beautifully in this selection of poems, which came out, I think it would 81 or 82, yeah. He did many other books, but I wanted to at least mention these for people here who love poetry and who would like to read some really wonderful translations from Indian languages. He also brought out some beautiful collections of folklore, The Flowering Tree, which is some of the Karnataka folk tales that he had collected. And in the folk tales, of course, he very often gave voice to women storytellers and women's perspectives, and bringing in some extraordinary anti-hierarchical, anti-caste, anti-patriarchal kinds of perspectives on Indian culture that were not the dominant voices that had been heard in literature. He was a wonderful teacher and mentor. It's funny because Guillermo never met him. Guillermo got interested in him, and I'll ask you to tell us how. But shortly after Raman's death, Raman died very unexpectedly and suddenly at the age of 62. He went into the hospital in Chicago for what was supposed to be a minor surgery, and he had some kind of allergic reaction to the anesthetic and died in minutes before they even started the operation. And it was a huge shock to everyone, needless to say. That was in 1993. And I'll just mention this as the last thing I say, is that one of the effects of this shock was it started me translating. I came back from Raman's memorial service in Chicago and just woke up one morning and said, who's going to translate now? And I had never thought about doing it. I had worked on some of the great Hindi devotional poetry, so-called medieval devotional poetry, but I had never really thought to try to do literary translation of it. And I began, as a homage to my teacher, I began doing it. And that's what eventually led me to this 7-volume project that I'm doing for the Murti Classical Library of India, which 2 volumes came out last January. So translating the title is The Epic of Ram, but it's a translation of the Hindi Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas. So I want to ask Guillermo how you, from Valladolid, Spain, got interested in this man whose life was divided between South India and Chicago.
Thank you, Philip. It's really a pleasure to talk to someone who worked under him and got immersed into his life as a student of Ramanujan. In my case, I think the first question I would like to, I ask my, when you get to India, I traveled overland, and this was not exactly the hippie period of the end of 60s and beginning of 70s, but I had always thought of going to different and the otherness of what we call from Europe. When you live in Europe, you perceive Asia and everything that's beyond Russia as something that's far away. But when you get on a train or hitchhike and get on buses and transport, slowly you end up in the East. So the East is not that far away. You don't have to cross any ocean. It's right there, And after one of these overland trips, just bumped into this collection of contemporary Indian poetry called 10 Indian English Poems edited by Partha Sarati. Bumped into it in Benares where I was living on a houseboat, and immediately when you read through Ramanujan's poems, because he was a contemporary poet in English, it struck me by its magic quality. The poems were like magic objects with all these different layers. You could look at them. You had to reread any of his poems. You have to reread because he's playing tricks on you as a linguist, and with the theme and the myth that's packaged in the poem. So you could really, he is a master craftsman, and is trying to tell you a story through a poem. So each poem is a story, and he's bringing that to you. He's bringing the Indian tradition to you, because just like somebody when he passed away, wrote a beautiful essay called "The Importance of Being Eke Ramanujan." Why is Ramanujan so important? Why are we here today, and why is it relevant to a festival like Jaipur Literature Festival? And I'll tell you my version of why, because I was able, perhaps as an insider, be able to understand after researching, and then after this encounter with his work. I joined Loyola College, and my wife, Monica, who will be doing a little piece, who's a dancer, joined me at Kalakshetra and got inspired by his poetry and translation as dancers.
Loyola College.
In Chennai, sorry. Chennai Loyola College, yes.
There are others.
So why did Ramanujan inspire so many people? And so many people from different walks of life, painters, dancers. There's just now a painting exhibition is going on in Bangalore, and that will tour around India by S.G. Vasudev. It's tribute to Ramanujan. It's about paintings, because his poems are very imagistic, Ezra Pound kind of objects, and they look like insects or they look like paintings. And at the same time, by bringing these translations of the Sangam, Tamil Sangam poetry to their own new generation of urban Indian dancers like Anita Ratnam, or even I don't know if you know dancers who are more steeped in the classical tradition like Madhavi Mudgal or Malavika Sarukai. Or they picked up some of these translations and were able to understand their own tradition. So I think there are many ways why Ramanujan is important. First of all, he was a pioneer. I mean, what he did. He put Dravidian studies on the map, and you will be able to speak more about that. In the early 60s, everything was Sanskrit and Vedas and Vedic, and the Oriental studies very much there. So he said there's another counter tradition, not counter, but a dialogue. And we'll talk about that intertextuality perhaps later. So here's another very rich tradition. It's not written in Sanskrit. It's written in Tamil, written in, as far as the Tamil Sangam, that ancient tradition is concerned, which goes back way back, and the Tamil tradition, as you know, is as ancient as any other of the very ancient traditions around the world. And then the medieval tradition of the Bhakti poems. He was all this treasure house of devotional poetry that was unknown to the West and unknown to much of India outside that particular region. Just imagine for a moment, mystics like St. John of the Cross, of Santa Teresa of Avila in Spain, who were immediately picked up and translated into French and German and English, but that they were still unknown in 1960. Imagine that they were still unknown to other traditions. So he brought Dravidian studies on the map, and he trained a whole generation of new scholars in Tamil linguistics, but not only that, he inspired them to do translation. both his American colleagues, new students, as well as his Indian contemporary poets. People like R. Parthasarathi, A.K. Malhotra, Jasawala, Nissim Ezekiyel. Guys, you have to translate your classics. You cannot just live in a bubble, thinking that you're a modern day Eliot or Pound in India. You can't do that. It's not possible. You have to have your tradition at the back of your mind. It has to resonate. He said, a poem is like when you play sitar, there are always the resonating strings. So a poem has to be like that. The tradition has to resonate in the back. It has to be there. You can try and imitate and become a Sylvia Plath, like Kamala does maybe, but unless it's rooted, but not only rooted to the content, but it has to be steeped in tradition. So he was able to convince a whole generation of, and his own contemporary poets, and he did that, from a distance. He was able to travel maybe once a year to to India. He kept in touch, and he inspired also anthropologists in India to do folk studies, to go out and do field work, applying, of course, also the Western. So that was what he was. He was a bridge builder, the best, from East and West. I know that's maybe a cliche, but his way of looking at academia and rigor. You had to be rigorous enough to analyze and study those texts and look at and also do translations rigorously, and then bringing those traditions in a fresh, very contemporary, direct manner to young, Western as well as Indian audiences. So this book, speaking of Shiva, it became like a cult book, hippies kind of cult book. And you may not know, but nowadays there are whole conferences on how much this book inspired whom? Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes was very much impressed by this book. And there was also another story of Ananthamurthy and at this conference in Hawaii, sitting next to Allen Ginsberg, and here's Ramanujan coming up on stage, reading some of his poems. And, Allen Ginsberg is supposed to have said to Ananthamurthy, I wish I could write like that, The economy, with the few words, what he could say, that was something magic. The economy of language. He had learned that from the modernists, but he had also learned that from the Vachanas and from the Tamil Sangam poetry. So it's not something that comes just from one source. It comes from all these different sources. And we, these bridge builders, translation, as we know it today in India, and translation workshops and the kind of work that Namita and Anita are trying to do. They were in Spain last week, and they want to try and do now these whole translations workshop between Spain and in India, because not much has been going on. So this whole school of what translation is about, he was a leader. He showed the way. He showed the way. So
I've been informed that we really only have very little time because you want to introduce Monica and the dance piece. So I want to plug Guillermo's book, of course, which just came out like last week. Yeah. And, and it's called When Mirrors Are Windows, A View of A.K. Ramanujan's Poetics. And as you can see, it is a formidable study. We're talking 500 pages here. I got a copy 2 days ago, so I've been able to just look a little bit at it, but it is definitely a very insightful and wide-ranging study of the poetics of somebody who was both a great poet and a great translator, and it looks at both dimensions of him. I would like to close my part of this before I let you introduce Monica with a little personal tribute to Raman. Two things that he said about translation, which I had seen before, but I just saw again in this book, and it reminded me of them, and I jotted them down. On the one hand, of course, is the humility of being a translator, and he said, translation is a modest art. It's the art of the imperfect. Which is something that one is always very conscious of, especially in translating from something as different as, pre-modern Hindi. But then he also said, and this kind of keeps me going, translating a poem is the most intense way of reading it, possessing it, even of being possessed by it. And that's something that I, you know, experience on a very regular basis in my kind of inner dialogue with the poet I'm translating, Tulsidas. I also want to say, my first work on Tulsidas was a study of the oral performance traditions of his text, and it eventually became a book called The Life of a Text, which is also the title of a panel here, but it's not about my book. But The Life of a Text, and that was the title of my dissertation as well as the later book, and it was the title of my proposal. And I remember handing my proposal to Raman in the hall in the building at Chicago where he taught, and him looking at it and saying, "The Life of a Text, that's nice. I can see that on a book." And which, coming from him, you know, and I, a lowly graduate student, that meant a lot. And 10 years later, I handed him a copy of the book, and I wrote in the cover, "To Raman, you saw it first." So I'll let you introduce.
Thank you. Just want to mention something about the title of the book. When Mirrors Are Windows. Of course, there's this essay by Ramanujan, which opens his collected essays on where mirrors are windows, where he speaks about reflexivity, you know, reflection in how texts reflect to another. It's his way of explaining intertextuality, which we don't have time to get into, but it is basically about how identity is a complex mosaic, and any text is a mosaic of reflections and dialogues and quarrels between other texts, old, ancient, traditional. So he took that T.S. Eliot idea of a simultaneous order, but he inverted it and applied it to Indian literature. So you know, you have a text that may be in dialogue with another text, which he called co-text, or it may be a counter text because it reflects in a different way to you know, is reflexive to another text, or it can be self-reflexive. It can become a meta text. It reflects on itself. So his poetry is full of the metaphor of mirrors becoming windows, and how a text suddenly becomes a signifier, if you want, in a whole new system, because it just, the energy of the text or the content just, you know, gets thrown out into the open. It's not just to himself. So the reason I chose this title is because I suddenly discovered at the University of Chicago, where I research his papers, this whole, you know, 3 or 4 boxes of his diaries. And his diaries, you know, were meant to be self-reflexive, were meant to be for himself. But they had this great potential of, you know, they were in dialogue with his published work. So in a way, his mirrors, his own mirrors, writing to himself, suddenly now became windows. And there's a beautiful poem that anticipates that, which I'm going to read now, which looks at the multiple identity of the self as a poet and as a person. So we're going to start this kind of performance here, and I will start with reading this poem, and then we have a little surprise here, and then a little bit of dance. But so I want to introduce Monica, who is going to do an interpretation, very free, kind of free verse. It's not in the classical Bharatanatyam style. It's inspired and based on the technique of Kathakali and Bharatanatyam that she has absorbed. But since she's going to interpret a contemporary poem by Ramanujan, we thought that it had to be more in contemporary style. Monica studied at Kalakshetra under ICCR scholarship throughout the 1990s. And then she moved on to Kerala, where she studied at Kalamandalam, Kathakali, and under Kalamandalam Raitishan, her guru. Also later in Trivandrum at Margi. And since then, after coming back in the year 2000, where we founded this Indian cultural center called Casa de la India, she's been running the Kala Sangam there, the performing arts school. And she's immersed in collaborations with flamenco artists, jazz, contemporary vocal. There's a piece that she's going to dance with Ravi Prasad, who's based in Toulouse, a very wonderful musician. Monica de la Fuente. So she does these dialogue with contemporary dance, flamenco, and her own tradition, and she's going to end, because we always think that poetry has to be embodied, and Ramanujan believed in that. He looked at poems as performances. So I think we're going to perform, and this is a little homage now to Ramanujan. Let me start by reading his self-portrait. It's actually, if you have a chance to see the... Yeah, it's also in the first page of the book, because it's interesting, but I can read it from here also. It's right there.
I remember hearing Raman recite this several times.
Yeah. Actually, this is his own handwriting. And when this is a draft from the 1960, it was published in 1966. And I couldn't believe, once I had chosen the title for the book already, when Mirrors Are Windows, suddenly bump into this draft where in this one phrase, I'm going to read both versions, okay? He changes the word shop windows to mirrors. This is self-portrait. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in mirrors, and sometimes see in shop windows. Despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. I resemble everyone but myself, and sometimes see in shop windows, despite the well-known laws of optics, the portrait of a stranger, date unknown, often signed in a corner by my father. Let me just do this. Have you plugged it? Okay.
$7 was
The soft show.
Try again.
$7 was
The soft shoulders have turned yellow as gold. Eyes that vie with each other like two fish have now forgotten sleep, thanks to the great love she bears you. I don't understand this disease that afflicts my girl. Her waist, like a lightning creeper, now buckles under the heavy breasts that crowd her chest. What? What do you really mean to do about her, O Lord of Benevolence? To the devotees who say, Wizard, you took on the forms of swan, fish, tortoise, and magpie. Show me your grace. He shows his grace, our Lord of Benevolence. About him, the chieftain of Tilmande town, with its great, long-standing buildings, our Arra who carries a sickle spear, has sung these songs in his gifted voice. Anyone who sings them will wash off stains from her hair.
Snow. The sky reddish glow.
Well, with that very beautiful translation, we're open to taking comments or questions from the audience. Guillermo? Yes. Right? We have 10 minutes left for that. Yeah, and that's the usual format at JLF for those of you that are new to JLF, because we want to have dialogue, so. Yes, do you have a way of miking people? Okay.
I haven't read anything by him. I haven't heard of him before today, so or was. Where do I begin? What's my entry point?
Good question. Let's say who's the expert.
I think if you, it's...
We didn't mention the English collection.
Yeah, the English collection. If you're interested in the way he presented the Indian mystic tradition, I think speaking of Shiva is a nice way of really getting into something which you may have experienced before in other poetry of, from other countries, but in a very unique way, because you can learn also about a very amazing period of Indian history, in literary history, that's 11th, 12th century. And I think of course his collected poems have been published by Oxford University Press, but I think what, as a first reader, not only because of the poems are beautifully crafted and translated, but one of the things I forgot to say is the way he translated the reader. He said he didn't translate text. He translated the reader with these beautiful introductions. So if you have a little book like this, which is easy to travel with and you can carry it anywhere, you do not miss. You should read the introduction and the afterword also, because it gives you some of the clues, and it's beautiful essays are the way they're written. So I think that's the best entry point. And then once you've read this, you'll be able to understand his own poetry in English much better, which is his collected essays by Oxford University. This was brought by Penguin, and it's a very nice way of starting out with, I think.
But Raman was well known in the UK as a poet, and he always, I remember him saying at Chicago that he felt bad in a way that in the US he was known primarily as a scholar and translator and not at all as a poet. And he was very proud of his English poetry and the fact that it was often included in anthologies of great 20th century English language poetry. And his first book of poems is The Striders, which is the one that poem Self-Portrait occurs in. And so if you like, contemporary 20th century poetry, you might want to check that out. The Striders, right? And what was the second? He did a second, Relations. 50th anniversary of the publication of The Striders. Yeah, sir.
Which book inspired Ted Hughes? And Guillermo, was your book first written in English or in Spanish?
I rarely write in Spanish. That's another story. I was just made as a scholar in the English-speaking world. I went to Edinburgh University, did stylistics and linguistics there just before going to India. That's why maybe I was struck by these poems. So the book was brought out by Oxford University Press, India, and it's written in English. It's partially based on my PhD on A.K. Ramanujan, so it's very much in English. And the connection with Ted Hughes, it's quite interesting, but it was known by some of his friends, Ted Hughes' friends, and I've come across some of the letters where Ramanujan actually inquires to other friends, but is it true that Ted Hughes has read Speaking of Shiva? It's this very same book I just mentioned, this one. It's published in 1973. And my PhD guide in India, his wife, who's an expert in Kannada literature, wrote an essay while I was doing my PhD, and we talked about Ramanujan. And she presented an essay on, the Vachanas in Ted Hughes' works at a conference in UK. And that spurred a lot of interest, and this was maybe 15 years ago, and after that more and more people have started researching that connection. So in a way I'm also responsible for that, because engaging with my PhD scholar and his wife and trying to find these connections, it has started a new line of research connecting Ted Hughes with this tradition, Indian tradition, the Bhakti Vachanas. Vachana means saying or utterance, which is free words. It's oral tradition.
Can I just offer a bibliographic footnote in answer to your question about where to start? I teach, or have been teaching, of course, at CU, Introduction to Talmud Culture for Professionals. And I use a Ramanujan book that is in print. I think the Interior Landscape is out of print now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very good. It's called Poems of Love and War.
Mm-hmm.
And it's published by Columbia University Press, paperback. And like so many of Raman's great books, I always tell the students, start at the back. In this case, it's the afterword that gives you.
Gentleman in the back.
Could you say a word about what might be some of the traditional relationship of some of these early Bhakti-inspired poems with dance? It seems so many of them were equipped in ceremonial. The Namavar, for instance, seems to be various voices crying out for dramatic performance.
You mean with contemporary dances today, or?
He's talking about in Indian tradition.
The one line of work that he started where he really worked on poems that were danced was the Padam tradition, and he has this beautiful with Velchu Narayana Rao was a scholar in Telugu poetry and literature, and they have a beautiful collection called When God is a Customer. So that is from the point of view of those Devadasis, the dances that performed in the temples, because it's maybe very simplistic to explain it that way, but this whole tradition of expressing your bhakti means devotion, your love to the quality of a particular god or goddess was spurned a whole tradition in music, in dance, in poetry, and the poems. The Padam tradition is a dance that is supposed to be a genre that is supposed to be danced. It's a song, so you cannot tell the music, the Padam music, from the poem, from the text, and from the dance. If you go to any performance today of Bharatanatyam or Odissi, what they dance, the central piece is a Padam, and a Padam is a story, is a dramatic piece. And those poems are like little stories of, situations, like dramatic scenarios where a woman, may take up the role of, the devotee and the sati-pati relationship, and also the ambiguity between the lover and God as lover, and everything in the to play with words. So it is very much a tradition that was written in those days, that particular tradition that was supposed to be danced. You mean... yes, exactly. Yes, well, it's very interesting. In the 1940s, he was playing around with those vachanas, and he wrote several poems that were not exactly translations, transcreations. Those have not been published. Only 5 or 6 of them have been published in the 50s. But then what he did was, that's the whole idea of intertextuality. he wrote his own versions of a modern day Sangam poem or Bhakti poem with an ironic twist in the poem. So it was like a counter text to the medieval Bhakti poem. But he learned the same technique, he used the same technique where a metaphor, there's a beautiful poem, Anxiety, which is very much a Bhakti poem, and there may not be time, where you can read the poem, you read the poem and you say, oh, this could have been written by a medieval poet, but then at the same time, it's so contemporary. Yeah.
Thank you all for coming.
We'll talk now.
Sorry,
Thank you so much.
Close this session.